Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining today's announcement of NOAA's 2021 Winter Outlook. This media briefing is being recorded. If you do not wish to be recorded, please disconnect at this time. My name is Jasmine Blackwell, and I am the media contact for today's Winter Outlook. At the conclusion of this media briefing, you can reach me by email at jasmine.blackwell@noaa.gov or by phone at 202-841-9184. We will begin today's media briefing with remarks from our speakers, and then we will take questions from reporters. If you would like to ask a question during the question answer portion of this briefing, please click the hand icon in the GoToWebinar window next to your name. I will then call upon each reporter that has virtually raised their hand, and your line will be unmuted. You may also use the questions tool in your GoToWebinar window to type your question for our speakers about today's Winter Outlook. Please be sure to state or type your full name and media affiliation when asking your question. And with that, I would like to welcome John Gottschalk to open our call.
Thank you, Jasmine, very much. The National Weather Service plays a critical role in helping the nation become more ready, resilient, and responsive to extreme weather and climate events. Providing impact-based decision support services enhances the American public's ability to quickly make informed, life-saving decisions in the face of extreme weather, and ultimately results in a more weather-ready nation. The Winter Outlook is produced in order to give Americans, communities the best possible scientific prediction of how we think the winter will develop across the nation. The Climate Prediction Center issues these seasonal forecasts so users can account for risks and opportunities when making climate-sensitive decisions. This outlook supports everyone, from local and state governments that must plan for public needs this winter, to large and small businesses as they determine how the winter could impact transportation, market demand for their goods and services, and prices. The Winter Outlook is probabilistic in nature, meaning that the maps show these areas that are most likely to be warmer or colder than normal, or wetter or drier. However, the nature of a probabilistic forecast means that other outcomes are always possible, just less likely. And in fact, for our probabilities to be reliable, the less likely outcomes must occur from time to time. The second winter in a row, La Nina climate conditions have developed and are forecast to continue into spring 2022. Therefore, the temperature and precipitation outlooks are somewhat similar to the forecast issued last year at this time and are characterized by above average precipitation and colder than average temperatures for some areas of the northern tier of the U.S. and below average precipitation and above average temperatures across the South. More specifically, for temperature, the 2021 Winter Outlook favors warmer than average conditions across the southern U.S. and for much of the eastern U.S., with the greatest likelihood for above average seasonal mean temperatures in the southeast and along the Gulf Coast. Below average seasonal mean temperatures are most likely for the Pacific Northwest, northern Rockies, northern High Plains, and southeast Alaska. Portions of the northern plains, upper Mississippi Valley, and northern California have an equal chance for above, near, or below normal seasonal mean temperatures because climate signals are not as strong in these areas, so confidence in a shift in the odds is lower. The precipitation outlook favors wetter than average conditions for the Pacific Northwest, northern Rockies, Great Lakes, Ohio Valley, and areas of western Alaska. Drier than normal conditions for the southern half of California, the Southwest, the Southeast, and the South Central coast of Alaska are forecast as well. The rest of the country falls into the equal chances category, meaning that there are equal odds for above, near, or below normal seasonal total precipitation amounts during the winter months. That brings us to the drought conditions. Since late last year, widespread severe to exceptional drought has persisted across much of the western half of the continental United States, northern plains, and the Missouri River Basin. Short-term drought recently developed also across the southern plains and is also present throughout Hawaii. A major region of concern this winter remains the Southwest, where drought conditions remain persistent in most areas. Conversely, nearly all of the eastern U.S. remains drought-free currently. Drought conditions are forecast to persist and develop in the Southwest and Southern Plains, while in the Pacific Northwest, Northern California, the Upper Midwest, and Hawaii are likely to experience drought improvement. With that, I'll turn it back over to Jasmine to moderate the question and answer session.
Thanks, John. Before we move into Q&A, I would like to introduce Brad Pugh. He leads the Climate Prediction Center's Drought Outlook team and contributes to the weekly Drought Monitor. Brad Pugh will assist with drought-related questions, and also joining us on the call is Russell Vose, a climatologist from NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information. We will now take specific questions about the outlook from our media partners joining us in the webinar. I would like to first remind everyone of the instructions that were given at the top of the call. If you would like to ask a question, please click the hand icon in the GoToWebinar window next to your name in the attendees list that appears to the right of your screen. I will then call upon each reporter that has virtually raised their hand. Once you are called upon, your line will be unmuted. You may also use the questions tool in the GoToWebinar window to type a question for our speakers about today's outlook. Please be sure to state or type your name and media affiliation when asking your question. I would like to ask for your patience now while we are moderating your questions, as they may take a few moments for the questions to come in and organize them. Our first question comes from Emma Tobin from the Associated Press, and she's asking, can you please discuss the relationship with the predictions in La Nina this year?
Sure, this is John Gottschalk again from the Climate Prediction Center. La Nina, as many of you may know, is part of the what we call the El Nino Southern Oscillation Cycle, and it is resulting of cooler than normal sea surface temperatures in the equatorial tropical Pacific, which changes those tropical rainfall patterns and therefore changes the pattern of the jet streams across the Pacific and North America. And so these changes in the jet stream pattern result in a number of temperature and precipitation impacts that on average over many events result in a number of factors. For example, for temperature, we tend to see during the winter a warmer, above average temperatures more likely across the southern tier of the U.S. and across various parts of the eastern continental United States as well. Conversely, below normal temperatures are typically observed under typical La Nina conditions across parts of the Pacific Northwest, the Northern Rockies, and expanding into to the Northern Plains and Northern High Plains, as well as across Southeast Alaska. Now, for precipitation, La Nina conditions, again, on average, over many events, favor above normal precipitation for the Pacific Northwest, from down to perhaps Northern California and across to the Northern Rockies, but also across many of the areas of the Great Lakes, Ohio Valley, Upper Mississippi Valley, in that region. It's generally a drier signal or below normal precipitation that's favored on average for seasonal precipitation amounts along the southern tier of the U.S., from southern half of California across the Southwest, and also extending eastward to the Southeast, and a somewhat little bit weaker signal for south central coast of Alaska.
Thank you, John. Our next question comes from James Gilbert. James, your line should now be unmuted.
Hi, James Gilbert from WROC News 8, the CBS affiliate in Rochester, New York. So we're lake effect country here in the Northeast. I was wondering if you were seeing any trends or patterns within other teleconnections, most specifically the Arctic oscillation. I know sometimes when that swings negative, that can mean nor'easters and such. And so that's the first question. The second question, are you seeing any trends versus we're going to see more Clippers versus like Miller type A storms? Are there certain types of winter storms that you can lean towards? And so, kind of a two-parter there.
Sure. So with the first question, you're absolutely correct in the sense that in your region, the Arctic Oscillation or its cousin, let's say the North Atlantic Oscillation, as I'm sure you know, tend to result in more storminess and colder temperatures for parts of the eastern U.S., the Pacific, and as well as across Europe. However, although there's considerable research going now on a number of different hypotheses for how you can make a reliable seasonal prediction for the AO or the Arctic Oscillation or the North Atlantic Oscillation, there's generally considerable spread in whether how reliable those techniques are. So the bottom line is for the winter outlook at this lead in mid-October, it's difficult. It's not really predictable how often we'll be in a negative or positive phase of the AO. So we certainly look for those patterns in some of the forecast tools that we have, but we are limited often in being able to use them reliably. And in this particular case, we note that in our discussions that certainly can result in higher variability, and that's often the case for La Nina events. Now, with respect to the storm track, during La Nina events, again, on average over multiple events, the storm track is more inland, as I'm sure you probably remember or know, as compared to, say, El Nino, where the storm track can shift southeast, for example, across the Gulf of Mexico and then up and along the coast. And some of the stronger storms that we've had along the East Coast, for example, have been during strong El Nino events. For La Nina, the storm track is typically more often than not, a little bit further to the west as compared to climatology. And so some of those storms will have more warm air available to them along the coast, and the snow signal and the wet signal will be more across the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes, which is why we have that area favored. And with respect to Clipper systems, that's correct. You can generally see that in the flow diagram here, that very often during La Nina, there's quite a bit of variability or changeable patterns in the weather, such that you will get troughs and ridges moving quickly, and Clippers will certainly be a part of that. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you. We're getting applause ready.
Okay.
Our next question is written in the chat box, and it comes from Henry Fountain from the New York Times. He's asking, how does this La Nina compare to last year's?
Sure. It's a very good question. With respect to last year, one thing that we noticed in the ocean, the equatorial temperatures in the tropical Pacific, we were actually a little bit cooler than we are now. But one thing that's important to note with this current La Nina, it seems like the atmospheric response, the changes in the circulation or jet stream in the North Pacific and into even parts of North America have been a little bit more established earlier than, say, last year. As well, also, there's a reservoir of considerable colder water at depth in the Pacific, which is typically a precursor for decreasing SSTs or ocean surface temperatures in the tropical Pacific. So that's from the ocean perspective. From the atmosphere or forecast perspective, one thing that we've noticed with the outlook and some of the forecast guidance that we have available to us is perhaps a little bit of a colder signal than we had in our outlooks last year across parts of the West, meaning favoring below normal temperatures perhaps a little further to the south in the Pacific Northwest, and less above normal temperatures in parts of the far west and southwest, and also warmer conditions across parts of the eastern seaboard and across the Great Lakes, as the circulation changes with the La Nina this year right now in the model guidance appear to be a little bit more robust than they were in some guidance in previous months this year, which would produce a potentially more wavy pattern and more potential cooler temperatures across Alaska, Western Canada, and the Pacific Northwest, and into the Northern Plains, and potentially perhaps warmer temperatures along the eastern seaboard and southeast.
Thanks, Sean. And actually, that was a two-part question from Henry. He's also asking, is there anything unusual about going from one La Nina to another like this?
Yeah, I looked into that as I was doing the outlook, and considerable work with that. There's a number of different what we call double dip La Ninas, and with respect to how they occur one after the other, there's no real consistent pattern whether the second one is stronger or weaker or the same from the previous La Nina winter. However, I will say the last 3 La Nina winters, the second has been weaker, from the beginning of the late 2000s. But with respect to whether there's anything different, as I mentioned, we also utilize dynamical model guidance to help us nuance the general anticipated large-scale La Nina pattern. And as I mentioned, this particular event seemed to be more colder in parts of the Western and North America region and perhaps warmer across some of the South.
Thanks, John. The next question we have here is about drought, and it comes from Edward O'Brien. He's asking is, how could this potential La Nina impact our drought conditions? Will it be significant or no?
Yes, the drought outlook is on the slides now, and it could be significant. Again, as I've talked about earlier, there tends to be often below normal precipitation along the southern tier of the U.S. And with that being the expectation, or what we're favoring in the outlook, we do expect drought to continue to persist in many of the areas in the Southwest and southern Intermountain West. Although the monsoon was stronger and more prolific this year, the improvements were not enough to remove all of the drought in the Southwest area. And also, with drier conditions forecast on average over the 3-month period, we do expect drought development to occur across much of the southern plains, and also in small areas along the eastern seaboard, lower eastern seaboard, across parts of the Carolinas, extreme southeast Virginia, coastal Georgia, and in the lower 2/3 of the Florida peninsula. Now, on the positive news, the anticipation of above average precipitation, both rain and snow, we do forecast currently in the drought outlook for improvement or removal from areas in Northern California to the Pacific Northwest and across the Northern Rockies by the end of January in the current outlook.
Yeah, this is Brad Pugh at the Climate Prediction Center. And just to add on to John's good answer there on what we're expecting this coming winter in terms of the drought, I would say just to provide a little more detail in the forecast confidence regionally, the Pacific Northwest really stands out as far as like high forecast confidence for improving drought conditions. Due to 3 factors. La Nina, it's typically wet there during the winter. The next 2 weeks looks quite wet with heavy precipitation. Some areas could receive as much as 5 to 10 inches of precipitation. And then finally, we're going into the wettest time of year, November, December, January, February. So that's certainly help the drought situation there in the Pacific Northwest. And also Northern California.
Thank you so much. Our next question comes from Susan Wood. Susan, you are now unmuted. It looks like you're self-muted. All right, we'll come back to Susan. Our next question here comes from the chat window, and it's from Leo H. He's asking, are you leaning toward a weak, moderate, or strong La Nina for the upcoming winter season?
Right now, the best expectation is that this will be a moderate event, perhaps a more upper end moderate event, given some of the forecasts, model guidance that we have with the actual eventual Central Pacific SST departures from normal. It doesn't rule out a strong event, but currently the probabilities are probably under 20% for that to occur. And a strong event would be SST temperature departures across the equatorial central Pacific, ranging on average greater than 1.5 degrees below normal. And again, that's not out of the question, but right now we're favoring more of a moderate event, potentially maybe a high-end moderate event currently.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from Nancy Garter. Nancy, your line is now unmuted. Nancy, there? All right, we will come back to Nancy. Oh, it looks like Nancy asked a question in the chat. Early versus late winter. When does La Nina have its greatest impact? And was the polar vortex an outgrowth of La Nina, or was it more short-term things like the Arctic oscillation?
Great question, Nancy. Typically, La Nina impacts, whether it be both the temperature or precipitation, are strongest in the later winter. Say January, February, March, actually into early spring. March can sometimes be some of the strongest impacts. And with respect to the polar vortex, or basically changing of the strength and phase of the Arctic oscillation to first order, as I mentioned, the forecasts are mainly driven by La Nina, but we do know that those impacts with respect to how the stratosphere, we know there's can often be stratospheric changes that sometimes do not, but sometimes they do link with the troposphere and can change the phase of the Arctic oscillation, as you know. And when the polar vortex weakens, it becomes more, let's say, wobbly, more north and southy, or wavy, if you will. And that allows colder, more Arctic outbreaks to shift down into the continental areas in the northern hemisphere, for example. At this time range, the forecast of whether the stratospheric polar vortex will strengthen, will be strong throughout the winter, or have some weakenings that are also associated with sudden stratospheric warmings, for example, are unclear at this time. But that's why some of the uncertainty in the forecast maps, that greater forecast leads that we're not talking about today, but we have on our website, you'll notice that the equal chances area across parts of the Great Lakes, this is for temperature in the Great Lakes and into New England and Northeast, becomes quite larger because of that uncertainty that you in fact are highlighting.
Our next question comes from Mackenzie Bart. Mackenzie is asking, with above average temperatures in the Midwest projected this winter, do you think we will start to see a trend of this in upcoming winters?
No, I would say no overall to first order. The favoring of above normal temperatures in our outlook for December, January, and February of 21 to 2022 is mainly a combination of typically warmer impacts in those areas, especially earlier in the winter, across, especially with La Nina, and pretty consistent guidance from a number of different methods for warmer than normal temperatures. Longer term trends certainly play some role, but they are considerably less than in that particular area with the new update in our long-term period means in which our forecasts are anchored to.
Our next question comes from Kimberly Miller with the Palm Beach Post. She's asking, for Florida, does La Nina have a stronger tie to temperature or precipitation? And if there is one or the other that is stronger, why so?
Typically, the precipitation single is stronger, but in this particular forecast, we're not seeing guidance or forecast tools that are indicating that. In fact, our probabilities are pretty modest, even for below normal precipitation in Florida, as compared to some other years that we've had La Nina events. And this is mainly because, as I mentioned, there's more disagreement or less continuity in some of the indicators that we look at in making these forecasts for that drier signal. For precipitation, we actually have somewhat higher confidence. I mean, for temperature, I'm sorry, higher confidence, where our probabilities are greater than 50% for the 50 to 60% above average temperatures for the seasonal mean temperatures from December through February for much of the Southeast and Gulf Coast, including Florida.
Thanks, John. Doyle Rice, I see you have your hand raised, and your line now should be unmuted.
Okay, good morning. Thanks for doing this. Can you hear me?
Yes, hi, Doyle.
Oh, hi. Yeah, just, I know you can't predict specific weather events this far out and all that, but I wonder how does La Nina often factor into the big Northeast blizzards that can paralyze the areas from Boston to Washington? How is it more likely during a La Nina to have these big snowstorms in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, or is it less likely during a La Nina?
It's actually, for the most part, less likely. During stronger El Nino events, moderate to strong, and certainly strong events, we very often have had very strong nor'easter, major snowstorm events during the winter along the eastern seaboard that often can hit the major U.S. cities, Boston to Washington, for example. During La Niñas, on average, the storm track is shifted a little further inland, and so often it doesn't rule out certainly major blizzards. We have had major blizzards in the Northeast during the La Nina events, but that's mainly related to more just variability in the pattern at a given time. Typically, the storm track is more inland, further to the west, up the Appalachians and so on, such that warmer air will work its way in, and that the more heavier precipitation signal is actually over the Great Lakes. If you look at typically for La Nina, looking at many events on average, snowfall actually is below average in the Mid-Atlantic during La Nina when you look at composites. And that would include Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Eastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, even up to New York City. However, as we get later into winter, there is actually an increase in snowfall during La Nina events at parts of northern New England, say north of Boston, and then it's down across parts of the western areas of New York State and Pennsylvania, and then in the Great Lakes because of that difference in storm track. So it doesn't rule out a bit major northeast blizzard event, as you're noting, but it is less likely on average.
Thanks, Sean. Our next question comes from Will Wade with Bloomberg News. Will is asking, are you expecting to see any polar vortex type of cold snaps?
At this forecast lead time, it's not really possible reliably to make a prediction like that. Those events typically occur later in the winter, say in January and February, as those are mainly a result of stratospheric changes, which the atmosphere above the weather layer of the troposphere in which we live. And the stratosphere changes, as I mentioned before, would have to occur, meaning becoming more wavy and potentially having a stronger signal that reaches into the troposphere or into the weather area here that we live. And that's just not predictable at this forecast lead time. Now we will be able to monitor that as we go through the winter, and there are signs and indications at decent lead times, meaning several weeks perhaps, in which we may see that potential that may occur, and so we monitor those items. And an important point to that is that we issue, in addition to the seasonal outlooks, we issue shorter term outlooks. For example, outlooks that may look out for 1 month, the weeks 3 and 4, for example, or the next couple of weeks. And so we would be able to kind of have an idea pretty well at those points whether we're having a disruption in the polar vortex such that we would have colder air infiltrating the continental areas across the northern hemisphere at that sort of lead time. So I would ask and suggest as we go through the winter to take a look at the short-term forecast where we have a little bit more. We can say something more reliably about whether the polar vortex stratospheric polar vortex will be modified.
Our next question is going to be from Cassie McGrath. Cassie, your line should now be unmuted. It looks like you're actually self-muted.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, my name is Cassie McGrath. I'm with Mass Live up in Massachusetts, and I have a two-part question. First, could you tell us how climate change impacts La Niñas? And on the other hand, is the La Niña this year expected to disrupt climate trends, specifically here in the Northeast, where we've seen the greatest temperature increases compared to the rest of the United States?
I think that perhaps Jasmine Russell may be the best person to answer the first question, if that's possible.
Hi, this is Russ Bose from the National Centers for Environmental Information. I believe your question was on basically, will La Niñas and El Niños change in the future? And I think the best way to characterize it is we're not expecting big changes in either El Nino or La Nina going forward. There's still going to be the dominant mode, if you will, of like variability in the atmosphere. And so, no, we don't expect at this point major changes in either.
So just to be clear, I was trying to kind of get at here if if La Niñas can impact, climate trends overall, but will we continue to see warming despite colder temperatures this year?
Yes, I think if you're looking over the course of decades into the future, the things that drive changes are increases in, say, carbon dioxide and methane and other greenhouse gases, which just simply slowly warm the atmosphere going forward. But the way the atmosphere works in terms of seasons, we still have winters, we still have summers, we still have things like La Nina and El Niños that happen. And greenhouse gas changes or increases don't affect the way those things tend to play out in the future. At least that's our best understanding of the science at this point. So if John is still doing this job 30 years from now, he will still probably be having to contend with the same, La Nina sort of challenges that he has right now. But the background temperature could easily be warmer at the global scale by several tenths of a degree or more.
Thank you so much.
Our next question is going to come from Edward O'Brien. Muted.
Good morning. Really, again, want to echo others. Thank you for this opportunity. Last year here in Montana, and I'm from Montana Public Radio, it was winter in name only, really. It was just an extended spring, really pushed us deeper into drought. You talked about La Nina's impact on the Pacific Northwest. What about us in Montana, in the Northern Rockies? Can you drill down a little deeper? And part two, very briefly, how accurate are these early outlooks in general?
Sure. So the first part of your question is, on average, when you look at all many La Nina events, which is what we have to do in the climate business, is that typically for your area in Montana, you would be favored to be below normal temperatures and above normal precipitation. Now, I understand that that did not happen last year, and one of the characteristics of all of these outlooks is that there will always be variability and events that are unforeseen or not predictable, as I mentioned earlier a few times, at this forecast lead time, such that you can have your forecast, if you will, verify or the observations match very well for a significant part of your forecast. But then an event that's on a shorter time scale that's not really predictable can make a bit large change. And an example of that was actually with our winter forecast last year for temperature, not specifically in your area, but in general across the U.S., where we had a pretty warm December and January for much of the country. And then we had an extremely cold February with that extreme cold, highly impactful cold event that reached down to the Gulf Coast and Texas and so on. And so right now, again, as I mentioned, we're still favoring for you on Montana below normal temperatures and above average precipitation. So hopefully your winter will not be non-existent this year. With respect to the accuracy, or what we would call forecast skill of these outlooks, generally one way to look at that is you use the outlooks over the long term. Is that, as you mentioned, any one outlook may not be as accurate as we would like in any given year, but on average, the forecasts are what we would call skillful. And to try to put a number on that, generally, the outlooks at this time are about a 50% improvement over what you would have by just using climatology or a random forecast alone. So they do provide important information and skill.
Thank you very much.
Our next question comes from Michael Easterbrook. His question is, what is the winter precipitation outlook specifically for California's Central Valley, both for the northern and southern parts of the valley?
Great question. And unfortunately, California is typically a dividing line. From a La Nina impact perspective, the state of California is, Central California especially, is often in a dividing line between some of the more reliable impacts to the north of a wetter and cooler, and warmer and drier across Southern California. And so there's always quite a bit of uncertainty. In fact, if you look back at other La Nina events over the historical period, you'll see during La Nina events in Northern California and North Central California that you can receive any one of the three categories often. And with respect to temperatures and precipitation, especially with precipitation. So right now we are favoring for the southern areas of California more of a slight tilt towards below normal precipitation, but in the northern part of the valley, as you mentioned, less reliable signal and not a strong climate signal really at all. But as we have seen the next couple of weeks, it doesn't preclude having wet periods and also following up by dry periods. In fact, the next couple of weeks, as Brad Pugh mentioned, will be a very wet set of days on average for much of Northern California and North Central California. So to answer your question, we're warmer and drier in the southern part of the valley, less confidence in that in the northern part of the valley.
All right, our next question comes from Max Crawford with KBTX in Texas. Max is asking, last year's winter saw a cold outbreak that those of us in Texas had not seen for 30 years or more. Are there any signals that we may find a similar cold break this year, even with La Nina this winter?
Yeah, great question. The answer is we're not able to be able to have an accurate prediction for that. That's not to say that can't happen again this year. It's just the science is not at a stage where that event occurred in later part of February, mid-February, which is actually at the end of the 3-month outlook period that we're discussing today. And at that sort of forecast lead time or with respect to the outlook, predictions of that type, that extreme event, those extreme events are not really, the state of the science is not there and not possible. And again, though, however, as we saw last year, it does not mean that they cannot occur. It's just we cannot say one way or another that would not happen or is likely to happen again.
Our next question comes from Kimberly Miller with Palm Beach Post, and she's asking, can you explain why it is common to have a double dip La Nina but not a double dip El Nino?
Well, I think very often, I mean, that one thing that's still an open research question about why La Nina is typically or more often or more common to have a second following winter for La Nina than say El Ninos. That's what we observe, and so we can comment on that. But as far as the overall dynamics and physical reasons for why that occurs, I still believe that that's an ongoing research issue. It might be better answered as a follow-up for you with other partners within NOAA.
Feel free to send me an email and I'd be happy to connect you with our experts. Our next question here comes from Lowell Melzer. Lowell, your line should now be unmuted.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, great. Lowell Melzer from WBAL TV in Baltimore. I'm following up to the Northeast question that was asked earlier. I'm just looking at the maps. I've had a chance to see everything. Temperatures in our area, 50 to 60% chance above normal. Precipitation looks like it could go either way. You mentioned the nor'easters and the snowfall. I was just concerned in our area, it is so hard to predict what the precipitation is going to be because of that darn 540 line. With what you're seeing right now in the forecast, do you think we can expect more ice events here or full-on rain events given the warmer temperatures? I'm just curious what your analysis is of that as we move forward, because these ice storms can be really crippling here and again, hard to forecast. We had one, I'll stop speaking, but we had one this year where we thought it was going to be all snow and turned out to be a tremendous amount of ice on the front end, a little bit of snow, and then ice on the back end. I'm just curious what you're thinking about here as we move forward in the Northeast region, particularly DC, Baltimore, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, that's just a great question, and my home is south of Baltimore, so I remember exactly what you're referring to last year. On average, how as I mentioned, the storm track typically will be shifted west on average over the winter. That would be what a La Nina response would be. And as you mentioned, would typically bring in warmer water off of the Atlantic Ocean. Ocean surface temperatures right now along the eastern seaboard are way above normal, considerably above normal. On the, I'd have to look closely, but on the order of 1 to 3 degrees above normal along much of the eastern seaboard and also across off the eastern part of New England. It's from one event to another. It's so dependent on obviously the track of the system, but also the timing of any other features in the upper atmosphere, for example, troughing and cold air, whether we have high pressure and to the north, as you know, across New England or eastern Canada with the timing. So you can have a brief warm up and get lots of precipitation that's liquid and then have cold temperatures behind it for several days, and your average temperature over that period that might actually be below normal. And so it's that timing that is very difficult with actually predicting. The one thing I can say on average is, like I mentioned before, the mid-Atlantic and the Baltimore region snowfall typically is less than normal during La Nina events. Whether there's more ice or more total rain is a difficult thing to say and would be event to event. And I wouldn't want to speculate that. However, again, as I mentioned, our outlooks as we get closer to various events, whether it be monthly down to the second week, 1 week out, let's say, we do try to make some assessments of whether there would be potential ice in our CPC hazards outlook in the extended ranges, as well as our regular temperature and precipitation forecast. So you may have a general idea, but again, that's shorter range. Really, the take-home point I would say is typically a storm track that's more west, so generally more warmer air in general, and on average, less snowfall compared to normal years. Hopefully that answers or helps your question.
Thank you very much.
Our next question comes from Mario V, who has his hand raised. Mario, your line is now unmuted.
The same question that was asked for Texas. We suffered quite a bit earlier in the year with snow and ice. And as I understand it, that's an atmospheric aberration. But is there confidence that we will not have the same setup as we did last year or early in the year for ice and snow?
Again, during La Nina events, we do favor warmer than normal conditions. So I would say it's less likely than normal, but it doesn't preclude another event such as what we had last year from happening. We're just not able to necessarily make that prediction to say, no, you're in the clear this year. That's not something we're able to do. But again, over the longer term or an average, it's less likely because of the La Nina pattern, meaning the colder temperatures are more likely to be across parts of the northern tier of the U.S. Again, doesn't preclude colder air moving south like it did last year. That extreme event obviously was very extreme and was a result of a number of different factors, in fact, that were originating from changes in the stratosphere. And as I mentioned, some of that activity is just not predictable at this forecast lead time. So we just really can't say that it won't happen again, but it typically is less likely.
Okay, so you could say in summary that this was a weather aberration, or was it, to use the well-worn phrase, a perfect storm?
I think that in this particular case, it was part of the natural variability, weather timescale variability within any winter. It turned out to be an extreme event. And yes, extreme events typically have a number of factors that come in together to produce that event. And if you want to characterize it as a perfect storm, that wouldn't necessarily be untrue. But there's always, within any winter, whether there's an extreme event or not, highly variable week-to-week variability, even within our larger scale climate pattern that we forecast.
Thank you very much for your answer. I appreciate you.
You're welcome.
Our next question comes from Susan Wood, who has her hand raised. Susan, your line should now be unmuted.
Good morning. Thanks for taking my question again. Oh, you gotta love technology, right? Okay, so I'm with the North Bay Business Journal in northern San Francisco Bay Area. And of course, we are mainly concerned with fires. And so we're constantly, plus it's very heavy ag land. So definitely concerned with the drought outlook. So I have a two-part question. With the in respect to the wildfires, I was wondering if there's any type of system NOAA is working on, or the Climate Prediction Center, in being able to gauge wind, because wind is such a detrimental part of what is driving these fires. And then the second part is relative to the drought outlook, because of course I look at what we have for the winter outlook, and I think, well, how is it that mainly you have equal chances in the Bay Area of above normal temperatures, but yet you have a drought outlook that could be improved? How does that work, John?
Yeah, definitely. Very good question. One is that, as Brad mentioned earlier, there's a number of factors with the drought outlook from Northern California up into the Pacific Northwest and Northern Rockies. One, it's important to remember that the drought outlook shown here is for November through January, so it's able to use information over the next several weeks and also November. And what we're seeing in the short term, quite short term, over the next few weeks, quite a wet pattern. In fact, 5 to 10 inches of precipitation in many areas, higher elevation snow, but still improvement there. Plus, entering the climatological wet season, that would typically, on average, also improve drought conditions. And again, with La Nina, although we have highlighted above average precipitation for the season, precipitation total amounts further north in your region, there is some tendency for storms and troughs of low pressure to also move south and stay a little further south and impact Northern California. And so that's why we're able to do improvement for drought conditions in that region, even though you're kind of in the borderline with the precipitation forecast. There's some other factors, short-term and also longer-term climatology.
And the wind question?
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Right, thank you for reminding me. At CPC, we're not working on that per se, but I know my colleagues in the research community, the Office of Atmospheric Research, are working on those areas, and also specifically with longer term and let's say week 2 and also longer term than that, experimental work for fire forecasts or fire outlooks, let's say. So that research is going on. It's not being done really at CPC, although we're partnering with them. We would have to get back to you, some of those colleagues, if you would like to talk more with them. But those areas of wind and fire are being looked at for more short-term climate outlooks as well. So the answer to your question is we are looking into it, but it will be some time before we're able to make official outlooks of that type.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Our next question comes from Edward O'Brien, who has his hand raised. Edward, your line is now unmuted. It looks like you're self-muted.
I apologize. I just forgot to take my hand down. Sorry.
No worries at all. Our next question comes from Nancy Garter. Nancy, your line should now be unmuted. Okay, we'll come back to Nancy. Our next question comes from Jason Samenow. He is asking, let's see here. You mentioned earlier that long-term climate trends are reflected in the outlook map because it's relative to the new normals. Now he's interested in finding out. He says he can't remember the last time NOAA issued an outlook map with a lot of blue for colder than normal conditions. And given that it's long-term climate warming trend, which increases the odds of a mild winter, being incorporated into these outlooks, or at least pushing you to lean that way?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yes, longer term trends are one of our outlook or forecast tools that we make use of. And how we make use of that is we compare the most recent 15-year temperature average with the WMO, or World Meteorological Organization, mandated 30-year climate normal. So that difference, a simple difference, indicates what we would see as a temperature trend. And we're talking about more shorter-term trends than, say, climate projections or decadal trends per se. And we do utilize that information. The trends have changed, as you noted, with the update of the new, what we call the base period, switch from 1981 to 2010 to 1991 to 2020. And so some areas that had stronger positive temperature trends have been reduced. And actually, in some areas, there are below normal, temperature trends that are negative. For example, during the February-March periods in the Northern Plains, there's a tendency for the long-term trend now is actually negative. And it's been some time since we have larger areas of negative trends in some areas. But overall, the temperature trend in most areas and most seasons is positive and remains so. And so those do factor into the forecasts, especially at some of the longer leads where we don't have as much confidence in interannual variabilities such as El Nino or La Nina or things of that nature. So they do definitely play a role and tend to tilt things for the majority of the CONUS a little bit more warm. I hope that answers your question.
Our next question comes from Jerry Oster. Jerry is asking, does this outlook indicate any potential areas of extreme weather, heavy rain, heavy snow, or anything similar? So essentially, heavy precipitation in any areas.
Right. It's a good question. As I mentioned, specific prediction information that we would feel confident and reliable saying is not really possible, let's say, at these longer leads. However, we do know during La Nina events, we can get a combination of factors that can lead to heavy precipitation events, and let's say in the Pacific Northwest, Northern California. In fact, we're going to have one of those in the coming week, where we have a circulation pattern across the Pacific and North America that is consistent with La Nina, even at this early part of the fall-winter season, where the upper level atmosphere dynamics are very favorable for a strong system linking with atmospheric moisture from all the way across the Pacific and the Western Pacific and some of the tropics. Very often these sort of linkages are referred to as atmospheric rivers. And these atmospheric river events can very often produce extreme precipitation events, rain at lower elevations, and if later in the winter or cold enough, have very heavy snowfall at higher elevations. So that risk is always there. For in the case of heavy precipitation or snow, the greatest likelihood of that this year would be across parts of the West, Northern Rockies and the West Coast likely, as opposed to the southern tier, where typically the storm track is generally shifted to the north. And so those are why those regions, as I mentioned, in the West, and also areas in parts of the Great Lakes would be a better chance for something like that extreme event with respect to either rainfall or snowfall.
Our next question comes from Robert Cronkleton. Robert is asking, for the Kansas City area, would you discuss the outlook for both Missouri and Kansas, and more specifically the Kansas City area? And can we expect more of a shift in the polar vortex again this year with extreme cold?
Okay, good question. With respect to temperature for your area, if I heard you correctly, Kansas City area, parts of southern Kansas, we do feel like there will be, we're favoring above normal temperatures in that region. There's a little bit more uncertainty with the precipitation outlook in that area because you're in the kind of the border between where we see typical on average impacts with precipitation. As you can see here, the above average precipitation is typically to the east or nearer into the east of Kansas City and more towards the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes. Whereas the drier signal is a little further to your south. And so you're kind of in more of a mixed zone where the uncertainty is high. Climate signals are less reliable or confident over the long term. As we do get into later into the winter, our drier signal starts to move up into, this would be for January, February, or in March, February, March, and April in our outlooks, in which the dry signal you see here actually expands north and east to include parts of Kansas, northeast Colorado and parts of Nebraska, and then recedes. And those are associated with La Nina impacts in the late winter and spring. Now, as far as the extremes, as I mentioned before, at this lead time, we really don't have evidence or feel strongly whether there would be an extreme event or indications of that either, of the cold snap that impacted the central and southern plains in February last year. We're just not able to make that prediction. To say that you will have that or not have that. Actually, the general conditions for La Nina would make that typically less possible. But again, as we saw last year, it can still occur.
Thanks, Sean. And the last hand that I see raised here is Nancy Garter. Nancy, your line is now unmuted. Okay, it looks like we're having audio issues. Nancy, feel free to follow up with me after this, and I'd be happy to connect you with an expert. That appears to be our last reporter question. And with that, I would like to again thank today's experts, John Gottschalk and Brad Pugh from NOAA's Climate Prediction Center, and Russell Vos from NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information for their assistance with today's call. A recording of today's briefing will be made available online at the bottom of our press release on NOAA.gov later this afternoon. And if you have any follow-up questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to me, Jasmine Blackwell, at jasmine.blackwell@noaa.gov or 202-841-9184. That concludes today's webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us today and have a great afternoon.